And on today's Newsmaker show with Dr. Gary Ostrower, we're going to talk about Jamestown, Virginia, as Dr. Ostrower has requested that. Good morning, Dr. Gary Ostrower.
Hello there, Brian. How are you doing?
Good, and how are you doing today?
Well, it's a beautiful day, right? It's a day that we can talk about not President Trump, not COVID-19, not protests in the streets, but rather talk a little bit about history today. I wanted to talk a bit about Jamestown, as you mentioned a moment ago. And when we talk about Jamestown, I am referring, of course, to Virginia. The reason it was called Jamestown was because King James I of England was the monarch at the time that Jamestown was founded in 1607, the first English colony in North America.
Yeah, that what you just got my first answer into the question that I was about to ask. Are we going to 1776 today, Gary, or we're going back all the way to May 14th, 1607? I'm getting this from the History Channel. Gary gets it off the top of his head, and it says May 14th, 1607, a group of roughly 100 members of a joint venture called the Virginia Company founded the first permanent English settlement in North America on the banks of the James River.
Yeah, about 145 of the 144 to be exact had left England some months earlier. About 107 of them arrived alive. That meant about one-third of them had died on the voyage over. That voyage over took about 3 months. Remember, the ships were sailing ships. They were relatively fragile, much, much smaller than would be the case even, let's say, 200 years later. And of that 107, about a year later, in the spring of 2000, in the spring of 1608, only about 44 of them were left. So what you had, in other words, was a situation where two-thirds of the people who had left England in 1607 had died by the spring of 1608. You had a very, very high death rate. And that high death rate is going to continue. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But when I say that high death rate is going to continue, I want to make the point that it was really, really hazardous to be one of those early settlers. The death rate during the Black Death, the so-called bubonic plague of 1348 in Europe, had killed off, depending on where, roughly speaking, about 33 to 40% of the entire European population. That is a huge, huge death rate. Compare that, for instance, to COVID-19 right now, where the death rate is around 1% or something in that area. But what happened in Virginia was much, much more lethal to any of those settlers than what was happening with the Black Death in 1348. And so, one might want to explain that. But before we even explain that, I want to make just a real quick comment about why they came over here. In many countries back during the 17th century, that's the 1600s, explorations such as in France, most of the Spanish explorations, they were financed by the governments. Okay, the governments wanted a leg up, so to speak, against their rivals, the French against the Portuguese or the Spanish or whatever. And so the governments would finance these expeditions. That wasn't the case in England. In England, it was all done with private money. They created something called a joint stock company, which is something similar to a public corporation today. So people could invest their money, not all of it. If the venture failed, they would not go broke, but by the same token, no single individual had invested so much money that he was at risk of poverty, should the thing fail. And so they had enough money to create these joint stock companies. One was a joint stock company for trade to the East Indies. That would be Indonesia today. Another to Russia. Another to Southern Europe. And, of course, we know about the Massachusetts Bay Company, who becomes one of these companies, and the Virginia Company. That's, of course, the company that's going to establish the Jamestown settlement. And so it was done, as I say, with private money. And the idea was that, hey, you had a bunch of individuals willing to invest with the capability to invest, and they were presumably going to make a profit. And the profit was going to be based on three things. Number one, for those Virginia guys, it was going to be based on finding gold in Virginia. They thought they would find the kind of thing that eventually we would find in California. Secondly, it was based on the idea that they could trade with the Indians. They knew there was a native population, and so they would trade English goods to the Indians and benefit from that. And thirdly, they would find what they called the Northwest Passage, which was a sea route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean that would allow them to reach China. They thought China was a lot closer than it really was. Well, there was a sea route, but that sea route was not going to be navigated until the year 1970 by an Exxon icebreaker, because it was completely icebound until global warming. Until very recently, it was completely icebound. So they failed in that area. So far as trading with the Indians, not much trade materialized. And the reason is because the Indians had very, very little use for most of the kinds of goods that the English were bringing over here. And so far as finding gold concerned, well, I think that most of you know that there's virtually no gold, if not any gold whatsoever, in the tidewater of Virginia. So the company failed to achieve all of its initial objectives, and that almost killed it. This Virginia company was very, very nearly a failure.
I have a lot of questions for you, Dr. Gary Ostrower. First one, obvious question, language barrier question. How did the English settlers communicate with the American Indians?
Not very effectively at first. On the other hand, once they remained there, and for instance, we all know about the story of John Smith. John Smith, for the first 2 years, was the leader of this Virginia company, of the Jamestown settlement. John Smith was captured in 1607, the very, very first year, by some of the local Indians. There was an Indian confederacy led by a chief named Powhatan. His daughter, by the way, was Pocahontas, who at that time was only about, we don't know exactly, but probably either 12 or 13 years old. But he was captured by the Indians and held for about 4 months in captivity. And when he was in captivity, he was actually taught some of the rudiments, some of the basics of the Indian language. So there was a certain amount of communication. And the Indians taught the Algonquins, taught the English some of their own language, and the English taught the Indians some of their own language. So while there wasn't a great deal of communication that way, certainly within a year or 2 years, they could communicate somewhat.
You mentioned Pocahontas there. Pocahontas gets a lot of reference these days, and in a pejorative way against Senator Elizabeth Warren, who claimed American Indian ancestry more than she had. Okay, ha ha ha. So they call her Pocahontas. But what do we know about the real Pocahontas?
Well, we don't know a huge amount, but we do know some. Pocahontas, as I said, was probably about 13 years old when the English first arrived. She was the daughter, and we're told, and probably true, the favorite daughter of Powhatan. He had a number of children. He was a very, very prestigious, a very powerful chief at that time. She did, in fact, teach John Smith, we do know this as a fact, some of the language. Beyond that, we don't know a huge amount. What we do know is that she might have saved his life, but that means she might not have saved his life. We're not sure. John Smith was a storyteller. He had been around. He was a real explorer. He had spent time in Hungary. He had spent time in other areas of Europe. He was looking to make his fortune, never really made it very, very successfully, and eventually, signed on to this trip to Virginia. He did become the leader of the colony for the first 2 years, and I would argue that the Virginia colony probably would not have survived at all if not for John Smith. He really was a very, very, rather brutal leader, but a very, very effective leader, and effective enough so that he kept the place together during those initial 2 years. He kept a journal, or at least he wrote a journal after he had returned to England. And it's really a kind of a journal of his entire life, like a memoir, I guess you would call it, dealing with, among other things, some of the adventures that he had in other areas, including Hungary. And what we know is this. a lot of the stuff that he put into those memoirs, that journal, was fabricated. It's just not true. There's absolutely no proof that he did some of the things that he claimed to have done. By the same token, we do know that some of what he wrote is probably true. There's corroborating evidence, for instance, about a rebellion in Hungary that he describes. So when he describes in his own journal that Pocahontas saved his life, he was going to be executed by Powhatan, and she threw her body in front of his to prevent the Indians from executing him, we have no evidence that that's true. Maybe it is. It's probably not true, because he did fabricate a lot of what he puts into that journal. What we do know about Pocahontas is that as she grew, she was somewhat influential, and John Rolfe, who became one of the leaders of the colony in the years after John Smith had disappeared, after he had returned to England in 1609, John Rolfe did bring her back to England to marry her. She died in England, so, there's a lot that we don't know. There's some that we do know, but the famous story about saving John Smith's life, that's probably not true, but we can't say it for sure.
Wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the American Indians and the Africans. Now, the Africans were brought in as part of the slave trade. Pretty safe to say they were treated badly right away. I wanted to know, what about the American Indians? When does the treatment of the Indians start to go badly? And also, was there ever an alliance between these two groups against the settlers, an alliance between the American Indians and the African slaves?
Not in Virginia. There would be elsewhere, but certainly not in Virginia. And it's a tricky question that you're asking, because we simply don't have enough information to provide all of the kinds of answers that we would like. There certainly were attempts by the English to enslave Indians, to enslave American Indians, the natives. And they didn't go very, very well. And there's a reason why. Number one, the Indians were on their own territory. If they escaped from slavery, they could, disappear into the woods. They could return to their own tribes. They were hidden by and protected by other members of those tribes. It gave them a degree of security that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Secondly, the Indians did not have experience in traditional European agriculture. And, what we consider to be, more or less normal farming. And that didn't help things. Thirdly, the fact of the matter is that the Europeans, the English, brought with them bacteria. They brought with them viruses. They brought with them microorganisms that had a devastating effect on the Indian population. So many of those Indian slaves simply did not survive. They had a very, very short life expectancy. Remember, the Indians had no exposure, no previous exposure to many of these European diseases. And I'm talking about, kind of common diseases, things like, at that time, measles and mumps, things like, certainly, smallpox, which was devastating to the Indian population. The Indian population, not only in North America, but in South America, was going to decline by about 90%. In other words, if you were alive in 1492 as an Indian, you were almost certainly dead by the time, within a relatively short period of time. Over the course of about 60 years, I'm talking about both North and South America, you had, I think, the greatest single, I guess we would call it a genocide, would we not? In all of world history. It was just devastating. And so the point I'm making is that the enslavement of Indians simply was not very profitable, and it was not very effective. On the other hand, the Africans provided, number one, they did have a much more traditional European style of agriculture. Secondly, they had no backwoods to escape into. They had no tribes to protect them. And thirdly, the Africans had a degree of immunity to some of the European diseases that the Indians did not. And I think the most important of those diseases, and it's going to be a really, really important disease for all of those people who are settling in that area, was malaria. I mean, the mosquito was critically important in terms of shaping North American history. the Africans had a degree of exposure, a previous exposure to malaria. It didn't protect them completely from it, but it made it less lethal than it did for the Indians. And I might add, by the way, that many of the Virginia settlers, remember I said a few minutes ago, that their death rate was very, very high. And one of the reasons is, they call this the seasoning, the first couple of years that they're there, they were exposed to things that they hadn't been exposed to before, including a degree of exposure to malaria that killed off many of them or else weakened them. The malaria can be a kind of chronic disease. It can weaken them, making them more susceptible to dying from yet other diseases, whether we're talking about mumps, or we're talking about dysentery, or we're talking about diphtheria or whatnot. So, life was rough back then. Life was really, really risky. The average life expectancy during that period of history was about 35 years. But if you made it to Jamestown, your life expectancy was probably going to be 1 or 2 additional years. And, Brian, there's one other thing I ought to mention, which I find to be, rather weird in some ways. And that is that the Europeans brought with them a knowledge of tobacco. They didn't know very, very much about it. Tobacco had originally been, if I'm not mistaken, I think it had been farmed in Brazil, but eventually it made its way up to Virginia. And tobacco was wildly popular in Europe. And so there was a huge market in Europe. And so the Virginia settlers began to develop tobacco culture, and they grew so much tobacco that they did not grow the very crops that they needed to stay alive, to sustain them from year to year, especially over the winters. And so they grew tobacco in their front yards, they grew tobacco in their roads, in the streets. They grew tobacco every place. The problem is that you can't eat tobacco. Tobacco, after all, contains nicotine, and nicotine is a poison. And so the very thing that they hoped would guarantee them success, in fact, further contributed to this very, very high rate of mortality, of death.
We're going to continue our very interesting conversation about Jamestown, Virginia with Dr. Gary Ostrower right after this.
Looking for various vendors, including farmers, yard sale crafters, direct sales, and advertisers for businesses to take part in a flea market and yard sale at the Butterfly Kisses Boutique location on Canasteo Street in Hornell on the second Saturdays in July, August, and September. The fee is $20 for a first-come, first-served reserved spot with parking. For more information, stop into Butterfly Kisses Boutique, 200 Canasteo Street, Hornell.
Oh, we missed meteorologist Rob Carroll. We'll catch up with him tomorrow. Sorry about that, Rob. Back with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, moving out of the 1600s to 1775, 1776, we know that Boston, Massachusetts had some pretty strong feelings about the British Empire. Okay, Jamestown, Virginia, that's where the British settlers first came. How did Jamestown, Virginia, feels in 1775, 1776?
Well, by 1776, Jamestown was a thriving community. But it wasn't so much Jamestown any longer, but right next door, Williamsburg. In fact, Williamsburg became the capital, the original capital of the colony of Virginia. But I want to go back to Jamestown in one other way, because I think it's kind of interesting and even important in some ways, relating to not just the history of the American Revolution, but in some ways even of today. You remember I said a few minutes ago that 144 men had set out. 107 of them had arrived alive back in 1607. Well, I said men. There were no women in that group. And what does that tell you? And what it tells a historian is that Jamestown was not expected to be a permanent settlement. It was expected to be a, kind of economic venture. Jamestown was a company. It was like Xerox. It was General Motors. It was a company. It wasn't going to be a community. The idea was that these guys would be here for a few years, they'd make some money, and then they would go back. And, of course, the company would benefit. Within about 3 years, they began to import women. And what that tells us is that for the first time, they did begin to think about Jamestown as a more permanent settlement. Now, there's someone else that they're going to, import, not only females, but in 1619, which is 12 years after the Jamestown was initially settled. By 1619, they begin to import Africans. Initially, only about 20 of them were brought over by a Dutch ship. But what Africans represented was a labor force. Now, remember, I said a few minutes ago, you had an awful lot of the English who were dying off, and yet they needed to sustain themselves, and they needed people to farm. They needed people for agriculture. They needed people, in other words, for labor generally. And so the demand for African slaves would be based on that need for labor, all the more so because the Indians were not working out. As a matter of fact, there was quite a lot of pardon me. There was quite a lot of conflict between the Indians and the Jamestown settlers. In 1622, the Indians, in a surprise attack, killed off 320 Jamestown settlers in one single attack. And the Jamestown settlers, I assure you, did much the same thing to the Indians. So the Africans became that source of labor. And while it wasn't slavery in an exactly formal way, the idea of slavery legally does not really develop until about 1660 and in 1661 in Virginia and 1662 in Maryland. But nevertheless, for all intents and purposes, those Africans were slaves. They had no way to protect themselves against longer terms of service and so forth. And so, slavery was here. Slavery became, in other words, a means of guaranteeing, from the perspective of those English settlers, a permanent workforce. And that, the 20 slaves of 1619 became over 100 about a year later. And then eventually, in some of the southern colonies, the numbers are going to really expand to the point, for instance, that by the time of the American Revolution that you just mentioned, in South Carolina, 2/3 of the population was black. 2/3 of the population was slave, and only 1/3 was free Englishmen.
With that, we have to leave it. Dr. Gary Ostrower, he said recently, I want to come on and just talk about Jamestown, Virginia. Very glad that you did, Gary. Very interesting. Thank you for joining us today, as always.
Thank you very much for having me here.